Romance and love are things that are part of the human condition. Some like to look at it through a more scientific lens of how they're just a result of the brain's chemical response for a desire to mate and pass on our genes, and as such, anything relating to love and romance correlate to that. Others like to be more artistic and philosophical about it, focusing more on how love affects the human psyche and how love and compassion are the most important aspects of humanity as a species, and a life without love isn't worth living. Regardless of if you take one of these stances or something else entirely, it's hard to dispute that we put a lot of focus on the damn thing when it comes to how we like to express ourselves. And because love is so important to us, it's only natural that we incorporate love into every facet of our lives to some degree. Love is a concept that we've been exploring through all different types of media, including video games. Some games use the concept of romance and love between characters as a plot device, some use it as a minor part of the narrative that's not super important, some use it as the defining part of the narrative that is important, and some use it as a freaking game mechanic. Fire Emblem, surprisingly, has managed to tick all of these boxes over the years. So, in honor of one of the most love-focused days of the year that is totally not a marketing ploy to sell candy, jewelry, and greeting cards, and was technically yesterday, let's talk a little bit about love and romance in Fire Emblem and whether or not they need it. Also, please bear in mind that this video is going to be a little silly and very opinionated about ships and things, so don't take it too seriously. So unlike other do games need it, I don't think I need to explain to you what love is, and if you do still need to know what it is, go ask your mom. But I do want to talk about how each period of Fire Emblem has handled it, because just like how gameplay and story elements have been handled differently in each era, so too is the concept of love and romance. And if you don't know what these periods are called, go watch the first minute of my previous video. Go do it, get out of here. The Kaga period mostly used love as a plot device or a means to move the game forward in some way. Since there was much less character interaction and overall dialogue between army members in the original game, there weren't a lot of moments of ship tease. Moments of unresolved sexual tension, longing looks, holding on to your lance a little too long when trading it to someone you trust. So when love did come up, it had to serve some sort of purpose to the plot or as a motivation for a character's actions. After all, the games were about war, and love and war tend to go hand in hand. There were characters like Julian, who saved Lena due to being a nice guy and also his attraction to the cleric, characters like Abel, who actually betray his liege for the sake of his wife's safety, characters like Roger, who defect because a pretty girl flirted with him twice, or even more far-reaching consequences of love, like how Hardin's descent into darkness came about as a result of his unrequited love for Princess Nina, who was actually holding a Stockholm Syndrome candle for Camus, who ended up marrying someone else entirely. In these cases, love was serving as a character motivation for something in the plot to happen, whether it be gaining a thief for the first time, making a risky situation riskier, or just kicking off the whole plot for a game. The only major exception to this in the Kaga period was in Genealogy of the Holy War, where love could be used as a game mechanic. The Lover's mechanic was essentially a prototype support mechanic in Genealogy, where you could play matchmaker with your units, or you could decide not to, say for Sigurd and Deirdre. Either way, the game marched on without it. And notably, this was also the last time the Kaga period decided to do something like this, as the next game was more of a return to traditional form. It was also the last game that Kaga directed before he left Nintendo for good. After losing its original creator, Fire Emblem started to go in a different direction through its story and character writing. The new support mechanic allowed specific pairs of characters to unlock special conversations that allowed us to learn more about the personality and backstory of each individual. However, unlike the lover system, characters didn't get married, at least not at first when it was first introduced into Binding Blade. Well, characters aside from Roy, I guess, who could get married to 6 potential other women, making him the most desirable protagonist until Awakening. I guess the boy had to have something going for him. Blazing Blade decided to greatly expand on that concept, not only making a narrative that was a lot more character-driven with its 3 main lords, but also making it so that many more people could fall in love within your army. This was no longer anime war simulator, it was now low-key singles night where we also murder people, baby. Now, even the regular army members could have paired endings with each other. Sometimes this ended with 2 characters falling in love and marrying, and other times it would just end with them being in love but not being able to tie the knot for some reason. aka 90% of Priscilla's endings. Jeez, lady, you need to just join a nunnery already. The support system became a staple of Fire Emblem after that, appearing in the next 3 games immediately after Blazing Blade before taking a break with Shadow Dragon and then resurfacing in New Mystery onward. Support conversations created a new layer of choice and replayability, but it also played a big part in influencing how romance was going to be handled in the years to come. After Fire Emblem decided to take a break from the rest of the world after Shadow Dragon, it eventually came back over here in full force with Awakening, bringing with it a new avatar system that we had previously missed out on here in the West. And when it came to love and romance, Awakening came out swinging. It came out swinging hard. Romance and supports was back in full swing with Awakening, which meant it was once again low-key singles night army time. Once again, people could chat each other up and get married. In fact, now multiple characters had tons of different options to choose from. When they got married, they had a kid who would come back from the future as an adult and who could also get married to any of the other future kids. Or Robin. Fates' support system was handled pretty much identically to Awakening, with all the same gizmos and doodads, but with a slight creepiness upgrade. And then finally, Shadows of Valentia decided to use a support model that was something of a compromise between the GBA support mechanic and the Awakening mechanic, making it so that the characters had no limit on their support conversations, but also only had one designated love interest. Whether or not they ended up with that person depended on if you bothered to have them reach max support rank by the end of the game and also live through the events of the story. Unless we're counting Alm and Celica, whose star-crossed lover story is about a third of the plot and is super canon. Yes. Okay, let's clarify on that point more. Yes, I believe Fire Emblem needs love and romance because while Fire Emblem is a fantasy story about lords, ladies, and dragons, it's still a story that involves people. And love and romance are things that are part of human stories. Not every story about people needs to be a love story, and not every story needs to put a ton of emphasis on that aspect of our nature, but Fire Emblem has always had roots in it, and it always will. So I see no reason to go out of our way to stop it now. However, even though I do believe that love and romance should be in Fire Emblem and are important to it, I do still have personal preferences on how I think it should be handled, specifically which model I like best. So if I had to pick which model from which era uses love the way I like best, I would say this one. And maybe some dashes of how Shadows of Valentia handled it thrown in. I'm gonna drop some truths with you guys. I'm a shipper. I ship things. I like looking at 2 characters and thinking, man, it would be so cool if they would kiss. The thing that caught my eye about Fire Emblem back when it was first starting to get released internationally was the fact that you could shack certain army members up through support conversations. That and the individual stats and RPG stuff were things that I thought were neat and groundbreaking for me, since the only games I had played similar in this genre was Advance Wars, where you just pumped nameless bazooka dudes out of a factory. So naturally this weans out the Kaga model by default, since most of the games don't have anything resembling supports or shipping save for genealogy. And I still enjoy these games just fine for what they are, but I just kinda prefer the later models more, where I have more control over my character's romantic endeavors. And you might be curious as to why, if that's the case, why didn't I pick the modern era model, since games like Awakening and Fates have pushed the shipping potential into overdrive with characters having multiple potential spouses, numerous support conversations, and even canonical evidence that they did it at least once? Well, it's because in a lot of cases, it kinda started to become quantity over quality. Something notable about Fire Emblem Awakening and Fates that I've mentioned before is that there is no longer a support limit. In the older games, characters could have a total of 5 support conversations per playthrough, so it was only possible to have them do a single, complete support conversation route. As a result, more romantic supports typically built up to some sort of love confession at A rank, but since there was no longer a support limit in Awakening and Fates, they had to get around this by introducing the S support rank, something that each character could also only achieve once per playthrough. On paper, this doesn't really sound like an issue since it meant that there wasn't some sort of awkward love confession between multiple characters and it allowed the conversation to actually wrap up, opposed to how in the older games you might get to be support with somebody, but then run out of support conversation so you couldn't finish it. Sorry, Oscar. Someday I'll see what you have to say. But in practice, it got a little weird, since characters had 3 conversations that had to remain platonic to avoid relationship writing fumbles. The 4th conversation had to suddenly kick the hormones into overdrive and have the 2 realize that they are suddenly totally in love and have been this whole time, and oh, somebody cue the Marvin Gaye. Okay, I promise it's the last time I'm going to use that one. Since each character now has a dozen different potential spouses, the writers have to come up with a dozen different support chains for each character, and to avoid having them feel cheap and lazy, these conversations also have to be unique in some way for each chain. In theory, this sounds great, but in practice, what actually ends up happening is that we see defining character traits of someone put on display a dozen different times, and it feels a little bit less special. One of the reasons that people tend to complain that Awakening and Fate's characters are just two-dimensional, one-note is because for a majority of their supports, we see them displaying their defining characteristics over and over again. Having to shoehorn in so many different conversations starts to make the characters feel repetitive and less special, even if the subject of each conversation is about a slightly different topic. And in the interest of fairness, this method of progression wasn't always awkward in Awakening. In fact, some conversations handled it really well. My favorite male Robin pairing in Awakening is with Cordelia, because it's one of the few conversations that Cordelia can have with a male member of the army that isn't about her unrequited love for Crom. And also maybe because Cordy ticks a lot of boxes for me. The conversation instead focuses more on Cordelia's feelings of imposter syndrome, survival guilt, and ends with her willing to accept herself and move on with her life while falling in love with Robin. Given how devoted Robin and Cordelia are to Crom, it's kind of amazing that they never mentioned the guy once in the entire chain. This is a great support chain that flows naturally and is genuinely sweet. And there are other support chains like this Awakening of Fates that are great, but it just kind of saddens me at how outnumbered they are for the sake of having more character options for shipping or just to be used in the eugenics simulator. Love is always going to have a part in Fire Emblem because Fire Emblem is always going to tell stories about humans going up against impossible odds to save their family, friends, or their world. It's possible to tell stories that don't focus solely on this aspect of human nature, but it will almost always find some way to creep into the narrative in some manner or another, no matter how big or how small. Ultimately, what matters is how this is handled in relation to the story and gameplay. Is love simply a character motivator? Is it used for shipping? Is it used to create powerful test tube super soldier babies? I think Fire Emblem has found varying degrees of success in all of these areas, and there's plenty of cases for all sides. Personally, I prefer when I'm given the option to have characters pursue romance without too heavily impacting what's happening with the story, and even having a choice with who they decide to fall in love with. But I also agree that there's something to be said about simply writing a story and incorporating the romance directly into the plot and character motivations without our direct input. Because in the end, all I really want when it comes to a love story is that it's a good one.
My love for you is like a truck, berserker. You fool. Do you want to making berserker? Berserker.